invite Dr. Zachary Burt, who's been a visiting research fellow with us at the center, as well as at IIT Bombay on a Fulbright-Nehru scholarship. At Columbia University, Dr. Burt researches efficient, effective, and equitable ways of incorporating climate risk into urban management policies. He has conducted field research in Tanzania, Kenya, and Morocco, and assessed urban water policies in California, India, and Kenya. He earned his PhD from the Energy and Resource Group at the University of California. So I'll hand it over to him. Enjoy the lecture.
Okay. So thank you to Ravina and Madhavi. It's been a pleasure being here associated with the center for the past year. I'm sorry to go, but I'll definitely stay engaged and hopefully be back after not too long. Thank you all for coming here tonight. It's really exciting for me to talk to you all and get you thinking about water and sanitation. I'm obviously very interested in this topic, and I'm happy when other people try and engage as well. So let's just get into it. The goals for today, I want to present how I understand water and the basis on which I build my research questions. So this is more of a broad, motivational understanding through looking at water through three different lenses. So can people hear me? I'm not sure if this is... No? Okay. Then I'm going to move on to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to look at the SDGs in a critical light. So I'm going to present what they are, just briefly, a few samples. Talk a little bit about how they're tracked and what their limitations are. So the takeaway message here, I'll just give you right now, is that they are useful, but there are some limitations. And anytime we look at them, we should think about them critically. Should I? Okay.
What if put the maybe put the mic a little higher?
Higher, okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. But this goal number 2, I'm just going to be using data from secondary sources. This is not part of my research. The research that I'm doing does, I think, build on the framework and the ideas that I'm going to be talking about when I review the SDGs. But then in this third part, I'll give 2 examples of my own research, which I hope you'll be able to engage with more critically because of the background that I cover when I talk about both the 3 lenses and the SDGs. And just to let you know, feel free to raise your hand at any point if there's a quick clarification. I just want to very politely reserve the right, if it seems like it's a more in-depth question, to postpone it until the end. But feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I want to start with a pop quiz. This is just to get you into the right mental framework, thinking about your own interactions with water and sanitation. So just in your own head, think about what did you use water for today? Probably bathing, drinking, washing, what have you. But then think further about where did that water come from? Did you get it from a tap? How is that tap supplied? Was it a tanker? Was it the BMC? Was it, and how much did you pay for it? Was it free? Did it come from a well? And then ultimately, thinking about a tanker or thinking about the larger Bombay municipality, where did they get that water from? So what was the ultimate source? Was it groundwater? Was it some sort of surface water? If it was one of those, who else was using that resource? And think about, yes, water is a renewable resource, but at any given point in space, for a given point in time, it is fairly finite. So think about what are the other competing uses for that resource. What are there? Maybe there's farmers that could have used that water instead. Maybe there's other cities that could have used that water instead. So just to start thinking about water as a larger resource that we're all working together in order to sustainably manage. And then lastly, once you used it, where did it go? So now we're thinking more about wastewater, about sanitation. When it goes down the drain, it obviously doesn't just disappear. Where does it go? Does it get treated? If not, who suffers the exposure of your waste. So even if you're not able to answer these questions, that's fine, most people can't, but start asking yourself. And maybe at the end of the day, or in the future at some point, if you're not able to answer these questions, I encourage you to try and find the answers. Is it still ringing or is it okay? Yeah? That's all right. So just very briefly, this is only a couple of slides going over these three lenses. And these three lenses are my own understanding. It's my own judgment as a researcher that I like to think about water in this way. You obviously could have a differing of opinion on this, but I came to this understanding because of this larger motivational question, which really underlies all of my research. And that's how can we expand human capabilities and maintain healthy ecosystems equitably, efficiently, and sustainably. Now, this is not a research question. This is not something that I go out and try and answer directly. It's more of a motivational question whereby I derive much more bite-sized pieces when I try and do my own research. But thinking about that larger motivational question led me to think about water in terms of three different perspectives. Water as a human right, water as an economic good, and then water as being essential to healthy ecosystems. And the more that I've done research in the field, the more I'm convinced that all three of these perspectives, depending on the context, probably have some validity. In my experience, whenever I look at water, I like to think of it as being all three of these things at the same time. And whenever you think about water as being all three of these different things, looking at water through these three different lenses, then you can start to see that depending on the context again, might be tension between two or three of these different perspectives, or there might be some complementarity between them as well. And so I want you to keep in the back of your mind these three different perspectives as I go through the SDGs and as I present the rest of my research. Now, when we think about these three lenses, there's a few words that I want to associate with each of these three perspectives, which will come up again in the SDGs. So I'm just going to list them here so that I can really highlight these concepts. So in terms of water as a human right, the words that I want you to keep in mind are accessible, safe, and clean, and specifically for human consumption is what I'm talking about here. And when you're talking about water as essential to healthy ecosystems, the concepts that I want you to keep in mind are sustainable and efficiently used. And then lastly, when we're talking about water as an economic good, I want you to think about affordability and equitability. So some sort of fair allocation, whatever that might be. Now, the SDGs, I would say, are rooted in the idea of the human right to water. So that's one of the three perspectives that I just talked about. But you'll see that the human right to water, as it is drawn from and it grows into the SDGs, you'll see that it starts to pull from these other two perspectives as well. So, as I said, these different concepts from all three perspectives start to infiltrate this human right to water. This is a lot of text. I don't want you to read all this text. I'm throwing this up here. This is an excerpt from the UN resolution which adopted formally water as a human right. Now, I do want you to concentrate on a few words here. And those are, again, safe, clean, accessible, affordable, and for all. And for all here, I think, is conveying this idea of being equitable, so some sort of fair allocation. The Sustainable Development Goals grew out of the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were adopted for the period between 2000 and 2015. The SDGs are fairly new. They were adopted in 2015 and carry us forward into 2030. The first thing that you might see from this statement is that it's a very broad goal. It's rather vague. Now again, this is a lot of text. Again, please don't read all this text. This is just to give you some idea of how that larger, broad, vague goal has been broken down into still fairly broad, but slightly more specific targets. These are 8 different targets here. And then indicators were chosen in order to track our progress towards these targets. Now today, I just want to highlight 3 of these targets to give you a little bit of a sample of what the SDGs are all about and how I think we should think about them in a critical way. And then these are the indicators that go along with those. Again, I'll just specifically bring them up here. And you'll see again the words that I wanted you to concentrate on from the beginning, which are access, safe, affordable, and for all in target 6.1. Sorry, and I should read. This target has to do with access to drinking water. So this is achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. Target 6.2 talks about achieving access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and an end to open defecation. And then 6.4 is substantially increase water efficiency across all sectors and ensure sustainable withdrawals and supply fresh water to address water scarcity. So again, highlighting these words, in 6.2 we see access and equitable, and in 6.4 we see efficiency and sustainable. So again, I would argue these 3 perspectives that I brought up from the beginning, you can see coming out in the SDGs as well. Now let's go over these 3 targets in turn. In order to talk about target 6.1, I want to introduce the concept of the water ladder. So this is what is currently being used by the UN in order to track progress towards this target. It categorizes water access in order to approximate a few of the goals embedded within the target. These categories are unimproved, limited, basic, piped, and then safely managed. Unimproved is any sort of unprotected spring, unprotected well, surface water. Limited means that there is some amount of protection here. You can see this is what a protected well looks like. But limited means that it might be at some far distance or it might not always be available. So that there may be some seasonality, some unreliability associated with that. Basic means that it is generally available and it is located at a distance such that you can go to that source, collect your water and come back, including any queuing, within 30 minutes. That's the criteria that needs to be met in order to be classified as basic. Piped water is fairly obvious. This safely managed level was not present in the Millennium Development Goals. This was added specifically for the SDGs. And this is some level which shows that water quality should be fairly assured. Again, this is hard to verify, but that's what's supposed to be indicated by safely managed. So in order to look at access, safe, affordable, and for all, and using this sanitation, water ladder, again, this level of basic is the goal. So trying to get everyone that doesn't have basic access up to basic access. The idea being that if they have basic access, then they should have access to safe water. And if everyone is up there, then it must be equitable. That's sort of the implicit assumption with this target, which I want us to think critically about. For me, this is an entirely subjective statement, but if this is the criteria of accessible, I would say that 30 minutes is perhaps not how I would define accessible, but this is the criteria that was adopted. And what is affordable? So affordability is not a metric that has been agreed on universally. There's a lot of people in policy and in research that argue 2% of income should be the upper limit, 5% of income should be the upper limit. There's no agreed upon metric, so if there's no agreed upon metric, then it's not something that we can track. So it's not currently as far as I know, being tracked by the SDGs. But it is something that people have looked at. So this is just an example. This is a little bit of a complicated graph. Let me walk you through it. So this is data that was collected in Tanzania by the WHO. If you look at this top bar, this is the cost of surface water, and the different colors indicate the percentage of income paid for access. So the gray color means no payment. This dark blue means up to 2%, then 2 to 3%, 3 to 4%, 4 to 5%, and over 5%. So surface water, as you might expect, most people are not paying for it. And those that are paying, there's very few people that are paying a large percentage of their income. Contrast that with tanker water. As you can see, tanker water, it looks like 84% of people are paying something, and a large percentage, 32%, are paying more than 5% of their income if they are accessing tanker water, which some people would argue is not affordable. And again, you can see that there's some division between urban and rural. Urban households are paying much larger percentages of their income in order to access water. So these are, this gives you some taste of how people are thinking about affordability. But again, since there's no definitive metric, it's something that's a little bit more complicated to track.
Exactly.
Yes?
On that graph, is there a correlation between your per capita income and what percentage of water, what percentage do they pay for the water? Is there some kind of data on that?
That is definitely something that you could look at. I do think that the data is available for a number of countries, but I don't know offhand. That's not an analysis that I've done myself. It would be interesting to look at, though. Again, thinking critically about this particular target, the metric is whether or not people have access to basic service. And this is supposed to be a proxy for safe water. But this particular study, again from the WHO, was looking at whether or not this metric does actually indicate safe water. And they found that there is a gap in between the proportion of the population that has access to basic service and the proportion of the population that actually has water which is free from fecal contamination. In particular, in Nepal, the gap was 74%. So it's rather high. In this case, in particular, I think it's easy to argue that this basic service is not a good indicator for safe water. But this is the metric that's being used. So I'm not saying that we should not use this metric. I still think that it is useful to use this metric to track progress, to compare across nations. But when we use it, we should really think critically about what we're tracking. And here, I would argue, we may not be tracking safe water access.
You know where India's country is?
We take all the questions at the end.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. If there's a more in-depth conversation, then I may defer to the end. But please feel free to raise your hand if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Sorry. Again, looking at the water ladder, now that we've thought critically about what this metric is and what it does and what it doesn't do, I'll actually show you the statistics that I've gotten from secondary sources, from the WHO and from UNICEF. And looking at South Asia's progress as well as India's. I do have to say that because Safely Managed is a more recent addition, there is not data available on safely managed water in South Asia or in Sub-Saharan Africa. We only have that data for Latin America. So here we can see, again, these are the stages of the water ladder. Unimproved, limited, I'll remind you, means that it may not be accessible all the time, may be distant, it may not always be available. Basic means it should be available with some degree of reliability if it's not too distant. Doesn't require more than 30 minutes to collect your water. And then piped water is obvious. And we can see that South Asia is certainly improving. More and more people are getting piped water between 2000 and 2015. More people, around the same percentage, still had basic, but fewer people had unimproved water sources. So that's definitely a good thing. In Latin America, there's some marginal degree of improvement, although not as much as in South Asia. And then in Sub-Saharan Africa, what's very interesting here is that piped water doesn't seem to be increasing very much in terms of the proportion of the population, but basic service is increasing quite a bit. What you'll see in a lot of African cities is that more and more people don't have access to the piped water network. And instead, they either have their own private bore wells or they're setting up these smaller community bore well systems. So it's an interesting decentralization of water access in many African cities. Looking specifically at India and comparing the total access versus rural and urban, and again, surface water versus unimproved, that's sort of the same category. You can put them together. Unimproved, which is not surface water, might be an unprotected dug well or something like that. And again, the same categories here. You can see that actually India is doing pretty well in terms of water access. If you look at rural versus urban, yes, the percentage is higher in urban in terms of access to at least basic service, but it's not that much higher. So there is some equity between urban and rural in terms of access to at least basic water service. But the difference might be starting to get into this issue of safely managed service. The data source that I was looking at had some percentage of safely managed service for rural areas, but it didn't have any data for urban areas. And I think that that's because that's mostly an open question. There's not a lot of really great water quality monitoring happening in many urban areas in India. And so I think that this is sort of an ongoing, more new thing that's being tracked more now, but we don't yet have a lot of good data on that.
What do you mean by safety manager? It's absent totally in urban?
No. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that it is there, but we don't have good data in terms of how many urban areas, how many people are covered by this safely managed.
Is that star cities or star cities?
So urban is
Star cities.
any urban area. Yeah. Now moving on to, I'll get back to 6.2 after we talk about 6.4. 6.4 is again talking about water. 6.2 is talking about sanitation. So I just wanted to have that continuity there. And again, talking about sustainable and efficient use of water. So how would we measure that? The metrics that have been adopted are water use efficiency over time and level of water stress. So water use efficiency is measured in terms of GDP per cubic meter of water. So this is entirely economic. It's entirely looking at the productivity of water. Level of water, which is interesting because here we're talking about sustainable in the goal, but the indicator that was chosen is purely economic. Level of water stress is looking at freshwater withdrawal over available freshwater. So this is a percentage. Now, the next two graphs I'm going to show you don't look good for India, but then I'm going to follow it up with some critical thinking questions, which hopefully reduces the impact. So in terms of water use efficiency, if you're just looking at dollars produced from cubic meter of water, India is much lower than most other countries, even compared to China, which had a comparable water use efficiency in 1990. As of now, it's grown quite a bit. United States, Brazil, even Nigeria is much higher than India is. Although India is going in the right direction, the rate of growth is nowhere near other countries. Fresh water as a percentage of internal water resources. Just to be clear, A higher number here is not good. You want to have a lower number. A lower number means that more of the water stays with the ecosystem. Or at least I think that's the implicit assumption with this metric. And again, India has a very high percentage. It grew through the 90s and then seems to have leveled off more recently. But thinking critically, again, I would say that I'm not sure that this metric is good as a one-size-fits-all. I think that it's still useful because you want to be able to compare across countries. That does put some pressure on the national governments. I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, India is, or at least South Asia, is a little bit unique in the monsoon weather patterns. If the implicit assumption is that lower freshwater withdrawals means more water is available for ecosystems, that assumption may not always hold in South Asia, where there's a lot of runoff due to heavy monsoon rain. It's possible. And then in terms of efficiency, I would argue that this is not a bad metric to follow, but is this the ultimate goal? There are other things that we might want to be producing with that water, and I think paying attention to those as well, I think is important. So the overall message that I'm trying to hit home here, and hopefully I'm not repeating myself too much, is that these metrics are useful, but we just have to think critically about them. And then lastly, let's talk about sanitation, in which case the target specifically says that it should be accessible and it should be equitable, so it should be fairly allocated. Likewise, we have the sanitation ladder, which has similar definitions. Open defecation is the lowest. Unimproved means that it is a pit latrine that does not have a squat plate. A squat plate is useful because it greatly reduces the risk that you might fall in at any point. Limited means that there is a squat plate or some sort of flushing, but it is shared. So that means that it might be public, or it might be several households using the same latrine. Basic means that it's either a flush toilet of some kind, or it's a pit with a squat plate, and only one household is using their latrine. But all of these, and these are all categories that were created for the Millennium Development Goals, which were during 2000 to 2015. For the Sustainable Development Goals, they wanted to go beyond access and talk about, well, what happens after the latrine. And so that's how this level of safely managed came in. So safely managed means that not only do people have access, but also the waste is properly treated before it is either disposed or reused. But again, unfortunately, we don't have great data. We don't have great data on safely managed. So again, thinking about access and equitable, this basic level, which I talked about in the sanitation ladder, means that you're either having a connection to sewer or septic tank, or a pit with a squat plate, and it's only used by one household. So looking at South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa again, we can see that in South Asia, open defecation, as we all know, was really high, but it's declined quite a bit over the last 2 decades. Interestingly, Sub-Saharan Africa has relatively, compared to South Asia, lower open defecation rates, but still a huge proportion of the population is using unimproved sanitation. So it has a different challenge there, not in terms of getting people to use the latrine, but getting people to invest in safe latrines. Compared with Latin America, there's a huge number of people, the vast majority of the population has access to limited service or basic service, basic service, but only a small proportion of the population has safely managed service. For this data set, which is available through the Joint Monitoring Project website, there's not good data in urban areas on what is safely managed. So that doesn't appear here. I have another slide right after this where I'll get into that a little bit. But you can see that whereas water access was fairly equitable in the Indian context across urban and rural areas, with sanitation, that's where inequity is really starting to come in. So there's a big difference in terms of sanitation access between rural areas and urban areas. But there is also this question, adequate was one of the words that was used in the target, and so that's what's getting to this idea of safely managed. And as you can see, this is coming directly from the government of India. Only 32% of wastewater is currently being treated in larger cities, and an estimated 8% of wastewater produced is being treated in smaller cities. So this is a big challenge for India right now, getting to that safely managed level. So I'm just wrapping up this SDG section and moving on to some of my own research. And I wanted to bring back this idea of the three lenses and remind you all, hopefully you've seen how these three lenses, these three different understandings of water came up with the SDGs, and I want you to look again for them as they come up in my own research as well. So the two examples I'm going to give you, one is the costs and benefits of an upgrade to continuous water service, or CWS, in Hubli-Dharwad. This is an older project we completed a couple of years ago, so I have the results from that I'm going to present. Then mapping an equity in the sanitation system. This is a brand new project. We literally just launched the survey a few days ago, so I don't have data to present here, but I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then give you some qualitative examples of what we are hoping to quantify through the research. But first I want to get you thinking and interacting with me a little bit in terms of CWS. Now, this is, as far as I know, there is no plan. There might be, I just don't know about any plan for bringing CWS to Mumbai. But I want you to think about, in Mumbai, should we have continuous water service? Is this something that you think would be good for Bombay or not? What do people think? Is this something that we should have? What are people's opinions?